A young liberal woman sees a man in the park with a MAGA hat and starts to harass him, eventually getting physical with him. She is shocked when she finds out who has been watching the entire time. George sat on the park bench, the late autumn sun warming his back as he flipped through the pages of an old paperback. The gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds set a tranquil mood. He adjusted his red "Make America Great Again" hat, which had begun to slip forward, and sighed contentedly. For George, moments like these were becoming rarer. The world seemed louder and more chaotic with each passing day. "Wow, that's bold," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up from his book to see a young woman standing a few feet away, arms crossed. Her dark brown hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and her oversized jacket hung off one shoulder. She wasn't smiling. "Excuse me?" George asked, his voice calm but surprised. "The hat," she said, gesturing toward his head with a tilt of her chin. "It's not every day you see someone openly flaunting their ignorance like that." George closed his book slowly, setting it on his lap. "I'm just sitting here enjoying the weather. I didn't realize wearing a hat was a public offense." Emily snorted, stepping closer. "Offense? No, no. It's more like a public service. You're letting everyone know what kind of person you are without saying a word." George studied her for a moment. She couldn't have been more than 18, still at that age where certainty came easy, where the world was black and white. He smiled faintly. "Well, if that's your interpretation, so be it," he replied, turning back to his book. But Emily wasn't done. "You think you can just ignore me?" "Typical," she said, her tone sharper now. "People like you have been ignoring the rest of us for decades. And look where it's gotten us. The planet's dying, the economy's a joke, and people like you are sitting around wearing those hats like you're proud of it." George kept his eyes on the page, though he wasn't reading. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said. "Oh, you're sorry I feel that way. That's rich," Emily snapped. "You're not sorry about anything. You probably don't even think about anyone else. Why would you? You've lived your whole life in a bubble of privilege. People like you have ruined everything for my generation." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unjust. George looked up at her again, his expression unreadable. "Miss, I don't know you. I don't think you know me either, but I'm not sure this is the right way to go about fixing the world's problems." Emily crossed her arms tighter, her cheeks flushing. "What would you know about fixing anything? You're part of the problem. Sitting here, minding your own business, like it's not your fault the world's on fire. That hat says everything I need to know about you." George leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "It's a hat," he said simply. "No, it's not just a hat," Emily shot back, her voice rising. "It's a statement that you don't care about anyone but yourself. You're sitting there acting like you're some harmless old man, but I see through it." George sighed and placed his book on the bench beside him. "What is it you want from me?" "I want you to admit it," Emily said, stepping closer again. "Admit you're selfish. Admit you don't care. Admit that you're the reason my generation has to clean up this mess." George shook his head slightly, the faint smile returning. "You've got a lot of passion. I'll give you that. But you're yelling at the wrong person." His calm tone only seemed to fuel Emily's anger. She threw her hands in the air. "Of course. You think this is funny. Of course. You don't take me seriously. People like you never do. You've spent your whole life getting away with it." George tilted his head, his voice still steady. "Getting away with what, exactly?" "With everything!" Emily shouted, her voice echoing across the park. "You're old, you're white, and you probably voted for Trump. You're part of the reason everything is so messed up." George said nothing for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Finally, he picked up his book again. "If yelling at me makes you feel better, go ahead. But I came here for some peace and quiet, and I'd like to get back to that." Emily let out a short, humorless laugh. "Peace and quiet. Must be nice to want that, when the rest of us are just trying to survive." George didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the page. Emily stood there, glaring at him, waiting for him to say something, anything, to fuel the fire she was so determined to stoke. When he didn't, she clenched her fists and took a step closer. "You think ignoring me is going to make me go away?" she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily planted herself directly in front of the bench, blocking George's view of the serene park. The light breeze carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, but neither of them noticed any more. George tried to focus on his book, but the shadow she cast made it impossible. "You're really just going to sit there, aren't you?" Emily sneered. "So smug, so self-righteous. Do you even realize what that hat stands for? Or are you just too comfortable in your little bubble to care?" George closed the book again, this time more deliberately. "Miss, I've already said I'm not interested in arguing. Maybe you should take a walk and enjoy the day." "Oh, I'm enjoying myself just fine," Emily replied, folding her arms. "I'm enjoying watching someone like you squirm. You sit there pretending you're better than everyone, but deep down, you know you're part of the problem. You just don't want to admit it." George looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. "You seem very sure of yourself, but I don't think you know anything about me." "I know enough," Emily shot back. "You're old, you're white, and you're wearing that hat. That tells me all I need to know." George let out a slow breath, measuring his response. "And what does that tell you?" "That you're stuck in the past," Emily snapped. "That you think the world was better back when people like you didn't have to answer for anything. You don't care about the environment, or social justice, or people like me who have to deal with the mess you left behind." George leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You seem awfully quick to judge for someone who just met me." "It's not judgment, it's observation," Emily said, her tone growing sharper. "And I'm not wrong, am I? You probably spent your whole life voting for policies that hurt people, and now you're sitting here acting like you're innocent." George rubbed his temples briefly before responding. "I was a teacher for 30 years. I worked hard, tried to do some good, and now I'm retired. That's the whole story. If that's not enough for you, I'm not sure what else to say." "A teacher?" Emily scoffed. "Let me guess. You taught history? Or maybe economics? Something safe and neutral, so you didn't have to challenge the status quo." "I taught literature," George said simply. "Oh, great. So you read books and told kids to write essays while ignoring everything happening in the real world. Very helpful." George's patience wavered, but he reined it in. "Do you think shouting at me here in this park is helping the real world?" "At least I'm doing something," Emily shot back. "Unlike you, sitting here with your stupid hat, pretending none of this is your fault." "I'm not pretending anything," George said, his voice firming slightly. "I came here to enjoy a quiet afternoon. You're the one who brought the noise." Emily smirked. "Noise? That's all you hear. A young person trying to speak up, and you dismiss it as noise. Classic." George straightened up, folding his hands in his lap. "No, I hear anger. A lot of it, and I think you might be aiming it at the wrong person." Emily's face flushed, her fists tightening at her sides. "Wrong person? You're exactly the right person. People like you are the reason everything's falling apart, and the fact that you're just sitting there, refusing to take responsibility, proves it." George shook his head slowly. "You don't know me, and you don't know my life. But I'll say this, blame and shouting won't fix anything. If you want to make a difference, maybe try listening for a change." Emily let out a harsh laugh. "Listening? To you? You've got nothing to teach me. People like you have had the floor for centuries. It's time for you to listen to us." "And what exactly should I hear?" George asked, genuinely curious now. Emily hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, her voice low and biting. "You should hear that your time is up. The world's changing, and people like you don't get to control it anymore." George met her gaze steadily. "If that's true, then why are you so angry?" The question caught Emily off guard. For a moment her bravado faltered, but she quickly recovered. "I'm angry because people like you refuse to move out of the way. You're holding us back." George sighed and leaned back on the bench, looking up at the sky. "Maybe you should focus less on pushing people out of the way and more on figuring out where you're going." The standoff stretched on, the tension between them thickening with each passing moment. George had returned to his book, or at least pretended to, his calmness infuriating Emily further. She paced in front of the bench, arms crossed, her sharp, heavy breaths slicing through the quiet park. "So, that's it? You're just going to ignore me?" she snapped. George glanced up briefly, then returned to the page. "I already told you. I'm not interested in arguing. Feel free to move along." "Move along?" Emily echoed, her voice dripping with mockery. "Wow, you really think you're above all this, don't you? Sitting there with your old man wisdom, acting like you're too good to have a real conversation." George didn't respond, keeping his focus on his book. Emily took a few steps closer, glaring down at him. "You know, ignoring people doesn't make them go away. It just proves how selfish you are. Is that what you taught your students? To bury their heads in books and pretend the real world doesn't exist?" George closed his book again, more deliberately this time. He folded his hands over it and looked up at her with a measured expression. "I taught them to think for themselves. You might want to try it sometime." Emily bristled, her fists clenching. "Oh, I think for myself just fine, thanks. And I think you're exactly what's wrong with this country. Privileged, self-absorbed, and completely out of touch." George tilted his head, his tone still calm. "If you've already made up your mind about me, why are you still here?" "Because people like you need to be called out," Emily shot back. "You don't get to sit here, all smug and superior, without hearing the truth." George gave her a faint, tired smile. "If that's your truth, I've heard it. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to finish my book." Emily let out a frustrated growl and kicked at a small pile of leaves near the bench. The leaves scattered, a few landing on George's shoes. He brushed them off casually, which only seemed to enrage her further. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Acting all calm, like none of this bothers you," she said, her voice rising. "It doesn't," George replied simply. Emily snatched a small pebble from the ground and tossed it at the bench, the stone bouncing harmlessly off the wood. George raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "What? No reaction?" she said, grabbing another pebble. This time, she tossed it closer, and it landed near his foot. "What does it take to get through to you?" George's voice grew firmer, though it remained calm. "I would strongly suggest you stop throwing things." Emily smirked, emboldened by the flicker of sternness in his tone. "Or what? You'll tell on me?" George leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "Or you'll embarrass yourself more than you already have." Emily flushed, the words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She dropped the pebble but didn't back down. Instead, she stepped even closer to the bench, standing so near that George could feel her presence looming over him. "Embarrass myself?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You're the one embarrassing yourself. Sitting here like a fossil, clinging to your outdated ideas. You're pathetic." George shook his head, his patience visibly thinning. "Enough. Go find someone else to harass." "Why? Am I making you uncomfortable?" she taunted, leaning in closer. "Good. Maybe it's time someone did." George exhaled slowly, sitting up straighter. "Miss, I've been patient with you. But if you don't step back, I will have to ask for help to make sure you do." Emily snorted, crossing her arms. "Oh, now you're going to play the victim? That's rich. What's the matter? Can't handle a little pushback?" George didn't reply. Instead, he picked up his book again and opened it, signaling that the conversation was over. But Emily wasn't finished. She reached out and flicked the back of his hat, making it tilt forward slightly. George froze, his grip tightening on the book. "Oops," she said mockingly. "Guess you're not as unshakable as you pretend to be." George removed his hat, adjusted it carefully, and placed it back on his head. When he spoke, his tone was ice cold. "Don't do that again." "Or what?" Emily challenged, a smirk curling on her lips, out of place between George and Emily. Emily's smirk hadn't faded, and she stood closer than ever, her presence an unmistakable challenge. "I warned you," George said quietly, his tone sharper than before. He placed his book on the bench beside him, his movements slow and deliberate. "What are you going to do about it, huh? Emily pressed, stepping even closer. You're all bark and no bite. Typical. George turned his gaze to her, his blue eyes steady and unyielding. I came here to enjoy a peaceful afternoon. You've made that impossible. Now, for the last time, leave me alone. Emily snorted, rolling her eyes. Oh, come on. Don't act like you're some victim here. You're the one flaunting that stupid hat like it's something to be proud of. George's patience was nearly gone, but he remained seated, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a full reaction. You don't like the hat. Fine, I get it. But your behavior says more about you than it does about me. Wow, Emily drawled sarcastically. You really think you're the wise old sage, don't you? Just sitting there, dropping little nuggets of wisdom while pretending you're not part of the problem. George shook his head slowly, leaning back on the bench. You don't want a conversation. You want a fight, and I won't give you one. Emily's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. She hated how calm he was, how unaffected he seemed. Her frustration bubbled over, and she grabbed another pebble from the ground, this time throwing it directly at his chest. It struck George lightly, but he stiffened. His jaw tightened as he stared up at her. That's enough, he said, his voice low and commanding. Emily crossed her arms defiantly. Or what? You'll call the cops? Go ahead. I'd love to see how that plays out. George exhaled sharply through his nose. Miss, I've tried to be civil. But if you think you can keep pushing without consequences, you're wrong. Emily laughed bitterly. Consequences? What are you going to do? Lecture me some more? You don't scare me, old man. As if to prove her point, she reached out and flicked the back of his head. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to make George rise abruptly from the bench. His movement startled her, and she took a small step back, though her defiance didn't waver. Don't touch me again, George said, his voice firm and unshakable. Emily's bravado faltered for a fraction of a second before she doubled down. Oh, look at you, all tough now. What are you gonna do? Hit me? Go ahead, make yourself the bad guy. George didn't move. He stood tall, his posture commanding, but his hands remained at his sides. You don't understand what you're playing at. Walk away, now. But Emily wasn't ready to back down. Fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to assert herself, she stepped forward and shoved him hard with both hands. The force caught George off guard, and he stumbled back a few steps, nearly losing his balance. He caught himself just in time, but his face darkened with a mix of anger and disappointment. Before either of them could speak, a voice rang out behind them. Hey, stop right there! They both turned to see a police officer approaching, hand on their radio. The officer had been patrolling the park and had witnessed the shove. Emily's confidence drained instantly, replaced by panic. Is there a problem here? The officer asked, looking directly at Emily. She stammered. He provoked me. The officer raised an eyebrow, glancing at George, who stood silently, brushing off his jacket. Sir, are you all right? George nodded. I'm fine. Just trying to enjoy my afternoon. The officer turned back to Emily. Throwing things and shoving someone isn't the way to handle a disagreement. Do you want to explain what's going on? Emily's face turned red, her hands trembling. He was being rude. He was provoking me. The officer frowned. I've been watching for a while. All I saw was you throwing things and putting your hands on him. That's assault. Emily's eyes widened in shock. Assault? Are you serious? He's the one who started it. George finally spoke, his voice steady. I didn't say a word to her until she approached me. I asked her to leave several times. She refused. The officer nodded slowly. All right, miss. I'm going to need you to stay put while we sort this out. Emily's breathing quickened as the officer stood between her and George, clipboard in hand. The reality of the situation began to sink in, but she wasn't ready to back down. Her voice was shaky but defiant. This is ridiculous, she protested, glaring at the officer. I didn't hurt him. He's just overreacting. The officer raised an eyebrow and remained calm. Miss, I saw you shove him. That's more than enough to classify this as assault. Now, I need you to calm down while I get your information. Emily's face flushed. Assault? Are you serious? I barely touched him, she pointed at George. And he was provoking me. He's not innocent in this. George, still standing nearby, kept his voice level. Officer, all I did was sit here. I didn't raise my voice or make any threats. I asked her to leave, and she wouldn't. The officer turned to George. Did you provoke her in any way? Even indirectly? George shook his head. I told her I wasn't interested in an argument. That's all. Emily let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, right. Sitting there in that stupid hat like it's not a statement in itself. The officer frowned, flipping their notebook closed. Miss, you might not like his hat, but that doesn't justify throwing things or laying hands on him. I need your name. Emily's hands clenched into fists. This isn't fair. He's the one who started it by wearing that symbol of hate. How can you take his side? The officer's voice grew firmer. This isn't about sides. It's about behavior. Right now, your actions are the issue. Emily's protest was cut short by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. Emily, what's going on? A woman in her 40s, well-dressed in a tailored blazer and flats, rushed toward them. Her face was a mix of concern and irritation. Mom? Emily's voice cracked. Linda stopped short, taking in the scene. Emily's flustered expression, the officer's calm professionalism, and George standing silently with his hands in his pockets. Her eyes narrowed at the officer. What's happening here? Why are you harassing my daughter? Linda demanded. Ma'am, the officer began, their tone measured. Your daughter was involved in a physical altercation. We're sorting it out. Altercation? Linda snapped, stepping protectively in front of Emily. With him? She jabbed a finger in George's direction. What did he do? George opened his mouth to respond, but the officer held up a hand, cutting him off. Ma'am, I was present for most of this. I saw your daughter shove him after throwing objects in his direction. That's why we're here. Linda's expression twisted in disbelief. Are you kidding me? My daughter would never do something like that. He must have provoked her. Mom, Emily started, but Linda cut her off. Don't say anything, Emily, Linda hissed. She turned back to the officer. This is outrageous. My daughter is an honors student. She's not some criminal. The officer sighed, their patience visibly thinning. No one's calling her a criminal, but the fact remains that her actions constitute assault. She will need to answer for that. This is unbelievable, Linda fumed. You're seriously going to side with him? Look at him. He's probably been antagonizing her the whole time. George spoke up, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, I haven't antagonized anyone. Your daughter approached me, started yelling, and refused to leave when asked. Everything else the officers saw for themselves. Linda scoffed. Oh, of course you're playing the victim. That's what people like you always do, isn't it? The officer stepped forward, raising a hand to de-escalate. Ma'am, I suggest you let us handle this. Right now, your daughter needs to cooperate. Refusing to do so will only make things worse. Emily looked between her mother and the officer, her bravado crumbling. Mom, I didn't mean— Stop, Linda said sharply. You don't have to explain yourself to them. The officer exhaled heavily. Miss, are you willing to cooperate or not? Emily hesitated, glancing at her mother, then at George, whose calm demeanor hadn't wavered. Her shoulders slumped. Fine, she muttered. The officer nodded. Good. Let's keep this simple. I'll need to take you to the station for processing. It's not a serious charge, but it needs to be addressed. Linda threw her hands up. Processing? Are you out of your mind? She's just a kid. She's an adult under the law, ma'am, the officer replied curtly, and she committed an offense. The police vehicle idled at the curb, its faint flashing lights illuminating Linda's furious pacing. Emily sat stiffly in the back seat, her arms crossed tightly, her face pale. The officer stood calmly between Linda and the car, clipboard in hand, their professional demeanor unshaken by Linda's tirade. This is absurd, Linda snapped, throwing up her hands. You can't seriously be taking her to the station. She didn't do anything wrong. The officer looked at Linda evenly. Ma'am, your daughter shoved a man and threw objects at him. That's classified as assault. My duty is to ensure the law is upheld. Linda turned sharply, jabbing a finger toward George, who stood silently a few feet away. And what about him? What did he do? You think he's innocent? He provoked her. George sighed quietly, hands in his pockets, but he didn't respond. Ma'am, the officer said, their voice calm but firm, I witnessed the events myself. From what I observed, the man remained calm and tried to de-escalate the situation. Linda's voice rose, sharp with indignation. Of course you'd say that. He's an old white man in a MAGA hat. You're just as biased as he is. George finally broke his silence, speaking with measured restraint. Ma'am, I didn't provoke anyone. Your daughter approached me, began shouting, and refused to leave when I asked. Her actions are her own. Linda spun toward him, eyes blazing. Oh, shut up. You've done enough already. Sitting there, wearing that stupid hat like it's not offensive. That's all the provocation anyone would need. George's shoulders stiffened slightly, but his tone stayed steady. It's a hat, ma'am. You're the one assigning meaning to it. Linda stepped closer to him, her finger pointed accusingly. Don't you dare talk down to me. You think you're so righteous, sitting there quietly, while people like you ruin everything. You're no better than she is. The officer stepped in, holding up a hand. Ma'am, I need you to step back. Let's keep this civil. Linda glared at the officer, her voice seething. Civil? How is this civil? You're treating my daughter like a criminal while this cranky old man gets away with everything. The officer kept their expression neutral. Your daughter's actions cross the line. I suggest you focus on how to help her move forward instead of deflecting blame. Linda barked out a bitter laugh, spinning back toward George. And you should be ashamed of yourself, acting like some innocent bystander when you're the reason this happened. George exhaled slowly, his voice calm but pointed. I didn't ask for any of this. Your daughter made her choices, and now she has to face the consequences. That's how the world works. Mom, stop! Emily's voice from inside the car cut through the argument. Linda turned toward her daughter, startled. Sweetie, don't worry. I've got this. They're not going to get away with treating you like this. Emily pressed her forehead against the window, her voice quieter but firmer. Mom, you're making it worse. Linda's face fell for a moment before her indignation flared again. I'm trying to protect you. Emily shook her head slowly. I don't need you to protect me. I need you to let me deal with this. Linda blinked, stunned into silence for the first time. The officer glanced toward Emily, then turned back to Linda. Your daughter seems to understand the situation better than you do. Linda folded her arms tightly, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a rebuttal. Finally, she snapped, Fine. Take her to your stupid station. But don't think this is over. I'm calling my lawyer. George shook his head faintly, muttering just loud enough to be heard. Unbelievable. Linda spun back toward him, her voice sharp and cutting. And you'll regret this. Mark my words. The officer stepped in again, raising a hand. Ma'am, that's enough. Please, let us do our job. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the officer turned and stepped into the vehicle. The car door shut with a soft thud, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving Linda standing on the curb, fuming. George picked up his book from the bench, tucking it under his arm. He adjusted his hat carefully, glancing briefly at Linda before walking away in the opposite direction. He didn't say another word. Linda stood frozen, her fists clenched at her sides, her sharp breaths visible in the chilly air. This isn't over, she muttered to herself, glaring after the retreating officer and vehicle. The park grew quiet again, save for the rustling of leaves in the wind. The calm, at least for the moment, had returned. Emily sat stiffly on the bench in the small processing room of the station, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The stark fluorescent lighting made everything feel harsher. Every sound, every glance from the officer filling out paperwork at the nearby desk. Her stomach churned, a dull ache of fear and shame settling deep inside. The officer glanced up from the paperwork. You're being charged with simple assault. You'll receive a court summons, and the charges will come with a fine and mandatory community service. Do you understand? Emily's voice came out quieter than she expected. Yes, the officer nodded, continuing to write. The door to the room opened, and George stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Emily briefly before addressing the officer. "I'd like to press charges," George said, his voice calm but firm. Emily's heart sank, her head dropping slightly. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. The officer nodded. "Understood. We'll file everything officially. If you'd like to make a formal statement, we can take it now." George gave a faint nod. "I will." He turned slightly toward Emily, his voice softening just a fraction. "This isn't about punishing you. It's about accountability. What happened today crossed a line." Emily's jaw tightened, her head snapping up to glare at him. "You think I don't know that?" George tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "If you do, then take this as a chance to think about what led you here." Emily scoffed, folding her arms. "You think you're so noble, don't you? Acting like this is some lesson I need to learn." George's tone remained calm. "It's not about me. This is about your choices." Before Emily could respond, the door opened again, and Linda stormed in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "There you are," she said, her voice thick with indignation. "I've been waiting for over an hour. What kind of operation are you running here?" The officer sighed, setting their pen down. "Ma'am, we're following procedure. Your daughter's charges have been explained to her, and we're finalizing the paperwork." "Charges?" Linda's voice rose sharply. "You mean this isn't resolved yet? Are you serious? This is a waste of everyone's time." George folded his arms but said nothing, watching as Linda's indignation filled the room. Linda turned toward him, her eyes narrowing. "And you? You're really going to press charges over this? What kind of person are you?" George met her gaze steadily. "The kind of person who believes actions have consequences." Linda let out a bitter laugh. "Consequences? She's just a kid. She made a mistake. And now you want to ruin her life over it?" "Ruin her life," George repeated, his tone sharp enough to cut through Linda's rant. "Ma'am, no one is ruining her life, but ignoring what she did would only enable her behavior. That doesn't help her or anyone else." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mom, stop," she muttered. Linda ignored her. "You think you're teaching her a lesson? You're just proving my point. People like you don't care about anyone but yourselves." George sighed, shaking his head. "You're not helping her by blaming everyone else. At some point, you have to stop protecting her from reality." Linda's face flushed red. "How dare you!" "Mom, enough!" Emily's voice cut through the tension, louder than anyone expected. She stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. "Just stop, okay? You're making it worse." Linda froze, stunned into silence. Emily turned toward George, her voice quieter but no less sharp. "You want me to learn something from this? Fine, I get it. I messed up. But don't act like you're some hero for pressing charges." George regarded her thoughtfully, then gave a small nod. "Fair enough, but whether I'm a hero or not doesn't change what you need to do now." Emily slumped back into her seat, the weight of the situation finally settling in. The officer stood, breaking the silence. "We'll process the paperwork, and you'll receive your court date soon. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on moving forward from this." Linda opened her mouth to protest again, but Emily shot her a sharp look. "Mom, don't!" Linda huffed, but said nothing, folding her arms tightly as the officer handed Emily the paperwork to sign. George watched them quietly for a moment before turning to leave. He paused at the door, glancing back at Emily. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope you find a way to turn this into something good." He didn't wait for a response, stepping out into the hall. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the small room, leaving Emily and Linda in tense silence. The brisk autumn air greeted George as he stepped out of the police station, his breath forming faint clouds in the cold. He paused at the top of the steps, adjusting his hat and taking in the quiet street. The tension from the past few hours still lingered in his chest, but as he exhaled deeply, he felt a measure of relief. George started walking toward his car, parked a few blocks away. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement was the only noise in the stillness. His mind replayed the events of the day, the confrontation in the park, the escalating taunts, the shove, and finally, the heated exchange at the station. He shook his head to himself, muttering, "What a mess." He didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. If anything, he felt weary. He had hoped his calm would diffuse the situation, that the girl, Emily, would lose interest and move on, but she hadn't. Instead, it had spiraled into something far worse than he could have imagined. He stopped at the edge of the park, the same bench where everything had started just hours before. The leaves were still scattered across the ground, untouched since he had left. George sat down, resting his hands on his knees, and stared at the space in front of him. Why? He murmured to himself. Why all that anger? All that hostility? He had seen plenty of passionate students in his teaching years, young people eager to change the world, full of energy and ideas. But this wasn't passion. This was something darker, more destructive. George leaned back, letting his gaze drift to the canopy of trees above. "She's young," he said softly. Maybe that's all it is. But he couldn't shake the memory of her mother, Linda, storming into the station, shouting accusations and deflecting blame at every turn. That, George thought, might explain more than Emily's youth ever could. He rubbed his temples, sighing again. How's she supposed to learn anything with a mother like that? For a moment, he considered the choice he had made, to press charges. It hadn't been an easy decision, but he believed it was the right one. Letting it slide, he thought, would have sent the wrong message, both to Emily and to her mother. Accountability mattered. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what would come of it. Would Emily reflect on her actions, or would she, spurred on by her mother, cling to the belief that she was the victim? "People can change," he said aloud, though the words felt hollow. He'd seen it happen before, but it wasn't common. Change required humility, and humility wasn't something he'd seen much of in Emily or Linda. George stood and brushed off his jacket. Dwelling on it wouldn't change anything, he told himself. He had done what he could, and now it was out of his hands, his. Inside the station, Emily sat in silence while Linda ranted beside her. "This is all his fault," Linda hissed. "I don't care what the officer says. That man provoked you. I should have demanded they arrest him instead." Emily stared at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mom, just stop," she said quietly. Linda blinked, her mouth opening to protest, but Emily cut her off. "I mean it. I don't want to hear it anymore. I messed up, okay? I shouldn't have gone after him. I shouldn't have touched him. This is on me." Linda's face twisted in disbelief. "Emily, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Emily snapped, her voice rising. She turned to face her mother, her eyes blazing. "You're not helping. You never help. You just make excuses for me, and I'm tired of it." Linda recoiled, stunned into silence. Emily took a deep breath, her voice softening but still firm. "I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. I need to own this, and I need you to stop treating me like I can do no wrong." Linda's mouth worked silently for a moment before she managed a weak, "I'm just trying to protect you." "I know," Emily said, her voice calmer now. "But sometimes I don't need protecting. Sometimes I just need to figure it out myself." Linda nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping as she sank into the chair beside Emily. George reached his car and climbed in, pausing for a moment before turning the key. The encounter had left him feeling older, more tired, but as he drove away, he allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Emily would take something from all of this. Maybe the consequences would give her the perspective she seemed so desperately to lack. And if not, well, George thought, at least he'd done his part to try. The car rolled down the quiet street, the trees lining the road swaying gently in the wind. Behind him, the station faded into the distance, and with it, the weight of the day. George sat on the same park bench as the week before, the crisp autumn air carrying a familiar stillness. The sunlight filtered through the thinning canopy of golden leaves, casting dappled patterns on the worn pages of his book. He adjusted his red hat, tilting it slightly against the breeze. The past few days had been filled with reflection, though not much resolution. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger never lasted long with him, but the memory of the encounter lingered, a mix of frustration and pity. He wondered if Emily had thought about what happened, if she had gained any perspective after facing the consequences of her actions. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice someone approaching. The sound of hesitant footsteps pulled his attention from the page. Looking up, he saw her, Emily, standing a few feet away, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her oversized jacket. Her expression wasn't the defiant scowl he remembered, but something quieter, almost nervous. "Hello," George said, closing his book and resting it on his lap. His tone was measured but neutral, neither inviting nor dismissive. Emily hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Hi," she said softly. Do you have a minute?" George raised an eyebrow, then gestured to the empty spot on the bench. "Go ahead." Emily sat down slowly, leaving a careful gap between them. She stared at the ground, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. For a long moment, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the faint chirping of birds. She started, her voice faltering. She took a deep breath and tried again. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for, everything." George turned slightly toward her, studying her with an expression that was hard to read. "Everything covers a lot of ground," he said finally. "What exactly are you sorry for?" Emily winced, feeling the weight of his words. "For yelling at you. For throwing stuff. For shoving you. It was wrong. I shouldn't have done it." George leaned back, his gaze steady. He nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Emily glanced at him, surprised by his calm tone. "I didn't think you'd forgive me," she admitted. George gave a faint smile, more thoughtful than warm. "I've been a teacher for a long time. I learned a lot about giving people room to grow." Emily fell silent, her gaze dropping back to her lap. She rubbed her palms together nervously. "They told me at the station that you pressed charges," she said finally, her voice tight. "I guess I just wanted to ask, why? Was it just to teach me a lesson?" George sighed softly, shaking his head. "It wasn't about teaching you a lesson. It was about accountability. If you don't face the consequences of your actions, how will you ever change?" Emily bristled slightly, but didn't interrupt. "You're young," George continued. "You've got time to figure things out, to make better choices. But ignoring what you did wouldn't have helped you, or anyone else, learn anything. Sometimes the only way forward is through." Emily let the words sink in, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I know. It's hard, facing it." George nodded. "It is. But that's life. You'll get through it if you let yourself learn from it." Emily hesitated before speaking again. "They gave me a court date. I'm going to have to do community service and pay a fine." She looked at him nervously, as if gauging his reaction. "That sounds fair," George said evenly. "Fair?" she repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Maybe, but it feels like too much." George's expression softened slightly. "That's what consequences feel like, but they're not meant to break you. They're meant to help you build something better." Emily exhaled slowly, nodding. "I guess I've got a lot of work to do." George gave her a small, encouraging smile. "We all do." They sat in silence for a moment, the wind carrying the faint sound of children playing in the distance. Emily shifted, standing slowly. "Thanks," she said awkwardly, "for listening, and for not, yelling at me or anything." George chuckled softly. "You've had enough yelling, I think." Emily smiled faintly, shoving her hands back into her jacket pockets. "Well, I'll see you around, maybe." George nodded. "Maybe." As she walked away, George watched her go, his expression thoughtful. For the first time since their encounter, he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps Emily would take this experience and turn it into something meaningful. He picked up his book again, but didn't open it right away. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, letting the autumn breeze carry away the weight of the past week.